It is a pleasure to be here. Deepak, thank you so much for the invitation. And we are now moving from the nature of reality to the reality we face and have created as a human species. And the question that we need to answer is, can humanity release itself from climate action paralysis? That is to say, can we actually take advantage of the opportunities that Ronaldo talked about and the amazing conversations we've had about what's possible? And I believe that there is a path, and that path relates to us as human beings and what we can do. So while we have these technologies, how do we move from where we are to take advantage of those kinds of opportunities? So we have a ticking clock. Most technologies will take at least 20 years to scale up. And we've found that political change is very difficult. That is to say, Washington is not going to be a place where we can make the difference, at least not right now. So what else do we have? There's a path, a legitimate, viable path we can follow. And that path has to do with how we live. And in particular, 70% of the carbon being emitted in the planet, on the planet, is coming out of cities. And 70% of the carbon emissions of cities are coming out of our choices, our lifestyles. The energy we use for our homes, our cars, and the choices we make around buying things. So the question is, how do we change behavior? How do we get enough people to make these changes? This fundamentally, I think, is the core of the issue around human consciousness. How do we move us to actually take that action? So the good news is we're the problem. Actually, that's the bad news. The good news is we can also be the solution. So here's how traditionally it's done. I call it social change 1.0. Al Gore moved forward the idea of climate change and the threat it represents with his inconvenient truth, and he raised awareness. But we found that it's a lot more difficult than just raising awareness to change behavior. So it didn't get the job done by itself. How many of you know all the things you should do but aren't doing? How many of you know that you should be able to lower your carbon footprint but maybe aren't doing that? Maybe you don't know how, whatever the reasons. Awareness doesn't do it by itself. The second one is command and control. Pass a law. If we could only pass a law, we would have a new possibility, perhaps. But we can't pass a law. We're too stuck. So that one isn't working. And then we have financial incentives. In California, they've had $300 million invested in trying to get us to do retrofits. And what we found was that they got 5,000 retrofits. You could almost buy a small house for the amount of time, the amount of money that people spent per retrofit. And then last is social protest. If all else fails, try to protest the system. But then it brings you right back to the same thing again. So protest doesn't do it either. So we're stuck in paralysis, and the current social change strategies are not going to get the job done. Certainly not in time. What else do we have? What I want to speak about now is what I call social change 2.0. And this is a 30-year journey that I've taken to try to move forward what in systems theory is called second-order change. So if you look at the world right now, every one of the systems, every one of the social systems that we deal with, be it the healthcare system, the education system, the political system, the economic system, has to change dramatically. We know it has to transform. But the tools that we have, social change 1.0, are not designed for transformational change. They're designed for incremental change. So in systems theory, when a system is in great stress, it becomes unstable and starts to go into chaos or into breakdown or low-level functionality. What's required in a system to move it to a higher level of performance and social value is called second-order change. And the work that I've been pioneering for the last 30 years is how to move forward second-order change. It has 5 core competencies. And I want to spend time not so much on the theory, but its application and what we can do and how we can apply it to climate change. But fundamentally, these are the questions that it has to answer. How do you get people to voluntarily want to change their behavior? How do you get a system, whether it be at the individual, at the group, at the organizational, at the community, at the system level, to transform? How do you do that? How do you build a social innovation capable of achieving that level of empowerment and that level of transformation? How do you get enough of the system, the whole system, to work together so you can make this happen? And how do you disseminate? How do you get enough people to do it? The solutions are out there. It's we, human beings, and how we operate that have to learn how to make these changes. So what I want to share with you is a journey that we've taken over these last couple of decades in particular on how to actually make those changes happen and what can be done. The beginning of the journey was for me in 1992 when I got wind of what the greatest leverage point was for change. Out of the Earth Summit in 1992, this was the key takeaway. The greatest cause of the deterioration of the global ecosystem is the unsustainable patterns of consumption, how we live, and production in the industrialized world. So the leverage point is how we live. And if we change, someone said yesterday, the demand side, the supply side follows. So how do we do that? So we set out to answer these 3 questions. How do you get people to adopt environmentally sustainable lifestyles? Since that's where the leverage point is, and in particular in climate change, it's even more personified now because it's 70% of the footprint. How do you get that sustained over time? And how do you make this process scalable? So that's the journey. So we began in 1991, and we created a program to see if we could answer at least the first question: how do you get behavior to change? We created a structured program with action recipes and focusing on all the core areas that are needing to change to live a sustainable lifestyle. And we put a peer support group of 5 to 8 households together. We called it an eco-team. We created a group process protocol that enabled that team to function. And we wanted to see if that would work. Now, this is a 10-year process of learning and social innovation and social iteration. What we found was that we could achieve significant and measurable behavioral change. We worked with some 20,000 people and achieved significant results. The second question was, will the behavior change be sustained? Every city that hired us, by now we were in 22 countries, working in hundreds of cities, and every city that hired us said, is this sustained over time? Or will this not be a good investment? So we had 8 studies, 2 longitudinal studies by 2 major universities that said the behavior was sustained over time and it was unsurpassed in changing behavior. So we had built a social innovation that could empower and transform. And the third part was, how do you get enough people to do it? And I came across a guy named Everett Rogers out of Stanford who wrote a book called The Fusion of Innovation. And what Rogers talked about was how new ideas spread, new seed strains for farmers, new medicines for doctors, new technologies. Some of you may know his work because his work has gotten quite popular, particularly in marketing. And he said there's 4 groups of people that respond to an innovation. The first he called early adopters. And they seek out the new, and they have a high tolerance for experimentation. They'll often show up at a conference like this. And what he found was that if you can get about 15% of a population, people on a block, cities in a county, counties in a state, countries in the world, to adopt an innovation, it can hit a tipping point where it starts diffusing on its own momentum. So what he basically said is you need to preach to the choir, and the choir will sing loud enough to get everyone into the church. And then it moves to the next groups, the early majority who are the belongers. The next one's called the late majority who eventually come along. And he said, don't worry about the last 15%. So we tried to find out how we could scale this innovation. And we tried to do it with social networks, with faith-based groups, with workplaces, with service clubs. But we got to the neighborhood, we had a breakthrough, huge breakthrough. We found co-benefits. That is to say, we found that we were able to tap into great needs that people had that were not being met, which was, the first one was conserving natural resources for the sake of your children. We drilled down was meaning and purpose, an intrinsic motivator. Getting to know your neighbors. I don't know my neighbors, but I would like to. Community. Creating a safer, healthy, more livable neighborhood, which was drilling down to self-efficacy. And when we had a neighbor invite a neighbor to share that at their door and said that script, which we basically developed into a script, 75%, the late majority, were attracted to those co-benefits and said yes. Half came, 75% joined, and we were getting 25% recruitment per block across the United States. So this was not just in California, because we had tapped into some deeper needs. This, again, is where consciousness starts to translate into behavior change, starts to translate into social change. There's an evolutionary biologist, some of you may know, Stuart Kaufman, who's coined the term adjacent possible. And what he talks about is that when you enter a door, 4 new doors opened, or 5 new doors. He calls that the adjacent possible. And these were the doors that opened for us. Let me just briefly go back to that slide. We started finding that we were able to generate green economic development. We were building demand. We were getting social capital built that were able to be redeployed around resiliency, livability, and many other social issues. We were building high-performing teams that could, again, take on other issues. We were building multiple social innovations in these cities that took off, and many entrepreneurial ventures took place as a result. And we were engaging citizens. We were moving them from passive victims to active, engaged citizens. So one of the questions that came out of this is this behavioral change methodology transferable? So as Ronaldo talked about and as Deepak talked about, one of the things that's so right now is that we are going to hit the wall at some point, no matter what we do. We've hit too much carbon in the atmosphere. So the question is not, will we reverse climate change? It's how will we mitigate its worst effects, and how will we adapt? And one of the things we have to learn how to do is create disaster resiliency in our communities, whether it's for this or earthquakes or just the multitude of unknowns. So New York City hired us and said, can we apply this methodology post 9/11 to see if we can build more disaster resilient communities? We can't just take the hits like that and not do anything. So we built a program. We applied the methodology to deal with energy disruptions, disasters, and so forth. We also created a part of it where these teams would take care of the vulnerable populations. And again, it provided really significant results. And we were able to get a 68% take-up, and 8 key behaviors were taken that were about resiliency. So the final place, and the place that's really now mission critical for humankind, is can we actually apply this to our crisis of climate change and lower our carbon footprints? And the city of Portland, Oregon asked us to do that, one of our cities. Can you do this around the issue of climate change? We want to get a 10% reduction, but we can't get citizens. We don't know how to do citizenry. We just know how to pass laws. We're good at 1.0, but not 2.0. So we applied the methodology. People calculated their carbon footprint. They selected from 24 actions, and we got 22% reduction, 41% block take-up. The book got issued in 2006. Al Gore became our evangelist because after the slideshow, everyone said, what can I do? And he said, do low-carbon diet. And some 300 cities picked up on this, and they were getting 25%. And tens of thousands of people, including in China, have been doing this program. So the question now is, can we scale it up? Can this methodology go to scale so that we could truly move the dial around the issue of climate change and human ability to actually get unstuck? I believe we can, because this is the right issue. It has the moral power and driver I've never seen an issue so scalable if we can engage people with the right tools. We think the time is right because there's a solution vacuum. There's nothing now available. We have tried the low-hanging fruit. We now have to actually take direct responsibility. I think the methodology has proven itself, and with the right communities and the right teams, and we've identified the right communities, and I think we've built the right team, we think it can happen. So enter the Cool City Challenge. The goal, simple goal, is 3 cities are demonstrations, 25% carbon footprint reduction per household, 25% of the city doing this, minimum, and doing this over a 3-year time frame. And bringing the whole system together, the business community, the civic community, and the local government, so that we create a whole solution. We've identified 5 cities that have signed up. We have letters of intent, and they said, we are ready to do this, and these are your quintessential early adopters in California. In California, because this is where there's $1 billion a year about to be invested to reduce the carbon footprint of California. So these are the cities, and these are our partners. We've put together an A team, Lawrence Berkeley Labs, Stanford, UC Davis, UC Berkeley, World Wildlife Fund, to help with the implementation, to help with the scaling, and to help with the design. So we believe this is a tipping point solution. This could literally tip the issue because, number one, it can reduce carbon significantly. Number two, it's ready to go. We can do this. Energy efficiency is the vehicle for where to start right now. Number three, it's cost effective. It's just labor. It's not huge technology. It's not billions of dollars. It's just tens of thousands of dollars, really. Hundreds of thousands max to get a city going. And it's scalable. We can take this from city to city. So finally, it's a whole system approach. Through driving change from the demand side, from the human factor, we can build new demand for technologies that are ready to go, the green economy. We can build demand for new policies. We can get them implemented. We can build demand for new markets. So it's the human factor that activates the whole system. So what does this look like when it starts to happen? What would it look like if we were living sustainably and we were living with a low carbon footprint, livably, and livability in our neighborhoods and resiliency in our neighborhoods? So to start with, there would be behavior change. We would actually be living a different lifestyle, a carbon-friendly lifestyle. We would be building a lasting solution block by block by block. And it's very doable. We've done every one of these elements, so none of this is new. It's just about scaling it now. Cool blocks would emerge. These lifestyles would become infectious, and we would start to see a whole new kind of way of being in these cities. And from that, what would happen is that these many of the things that we've all seen as the critical steps would start to emerge. Block gardens and composting and swapping goods instead of buying things, and carpooling. Resiliency would start to happen. We would be able to take care of the vulnerable people. There would be safer blocks. There would be blocks that could deal with climate change. And finally, these blocks would multiply into eco-districts, which are now the new rage in San Francisco and all the progressive cities. And those would now have the ability to grow from the bottom. And this demand would drive change, and the entrepreneurs, the kind of stuff that Ronaldo was talking about, would step in to fill this. And these eco-districts would multiply, and then we begin to have what we would call a cool city, a future that's not just surviving climate change, but thriving and building the future that we want. So this is possible. This is a scalable solution. And our goal is to scale it across California, the United States, and the world. It can happen, and we are ready to start. And the first city is teed up, which looks like San Francisco, and we're now in the process of putting it all together. So we believe that this is the future that can happen. It can happen now. And let me end with a quote that I think speaks to the mantra of this conference. Again and again in history, some people wake up, they have no ground in the crowd, and they move to broader, deeper laws, as in yesterday's presentations. They carry strange customs with them, and they demand room for bold and audacious action. The future speaks ruthlessly through them. They change the world. So, my friends, let's change the world. We can do it. Thank you.
Thank you, David.
The time is really, really right. There is so much readiness. So your help is greatly appreciated, and your participation is greatly appreciated. Thank you. Take advantage of the opportunities that Ronaldo talked about and the amazing conversations we've had about what's possible. And I believe that there is a path, and that path relates to us as human beings and what we can do. So while we have these technologies, how do we move from where we are to take advantage of those kinds of opportunities? So we have a ticking clock. Most technologies will take at least 20 years to scale up. And we've found that political change is very difficult. That is to say, Washington is not going to be a place where we can make the difference, at least not right now. So what else do we have around human consciousness? How do we move us to actually take that action? So the good news is we're the problem. Actually, that's the bad news. The good news is we can also be the solution. So here's how traditionally it's done. I call it social change 1.0. Al Gore moved forward the idea of climate change and the threat it represents with his inconvenient truth, and he raised awareness. But we found that it's a lot more difficult than just raising awareness to change behavior. So it didn't get the job done by itself. How many of you know all the things you should do but aren't doing? How many of you know that you should be able to lower your carbon footprint but maybe aren't doing that? Maybe you don't know how. Whatever the reasons, awareness doesn't do it by itself. The second one is command and control. Pass a law. If we could only pass a law, we would have a new possibility, perhaps. But we can't pass a law. We're too stuck. So that one isn't working. And then we have financial incentives. In California, they've had $300 million invested in trying to get us to do retrofits. And what we found was that they got 5,000 retrofits. You could almost buy a small house for the amount of time, the amount of money that people spent per retrofit. And then last is social protest. If all else fails, try to protest the system. But then it brings you right back to this. There's a path. A legitimate, viable path we can follow. And that path has to do with how we live. And in particular, 70% of the carbon being emitted in the planet, on the planet, is coming out of cities. And 70% of the carbon emissions of cities are coming out of our choices, our lifestyles. The energy we use for our homes, our cars, and the choices we make around buying things. So the question is, how do we change behavior? How do we get enough people to make these changes? This fundamentally, I think, is the core of the issue. It is a pleasure to be here. Deepak, thank you so much for the invitation. And we are now moving from the nature of reality to the reality we face and have created as a human species. And the question that we need to answer is, can humanity release itself from climate action paralysis? That is to say, can we actually